Hello, my name is Ellen Gambles. I am from the University of Sunderland and I am presenting today on the barriers to teaching games for understanding, teachers' engagement and implementation in England. I am presenting on behalf of my PhD supervisors, Stephen Anderson, Sandra Leyland and Jonathan Ling. So the background of this presentation is it is phase 2 of 3 main studies. The aim of the whole project is to provide evidence that can inform future approaches for PE teachers when using a games-based approach. To start off with, I want to discuss a little bit about phase 1 as it informs phase 2. Phase 1 of the project was all about examining teacher socialisation using occupational socialisation theory. This was with in-service PE teachers in England. The project also aimed to identify the barriers to implementing TGfU in schools and what the in-service teachers recommended as ways to reduce these barriers. So, as I mentioned, it was grounded in occupational socialisation theory, and the 3 sort of phases of occupational socialisation theory are acculturation, which is sort of your childhood experiences, professional socialisation, which is the university and teacher training, and organisational socialisation. This is on-the-job experiences within schools. So the phase 1 identified under each of these phases what the main influences and beliefs were. So for childhood, parental influences, getting children involved in sport was a very sort of key influence and belief that helped shape them become a PE teacher. Likewise, their experiences as a pupil in primary and secondary education. As we moved into the university and teacher training, they focused predominantly on sort of the theory, university side, but also the placement side. What the sort of influences were. They could remember a little bit from their theory, but not that much, but the placements were that predominant one. And then on the job with organisational socialisation, it was a lot to do with the department ethos. How did they run the curriculum? How did the interactions between their colleagues and the senior leadership team work? They also talked about their teacher knowledge and practice, how they've sort of developed as teachers, what their understanding is of games-based approaches. So there were 5 main barriers that came out of this phase 1 research, and this included a lack of time, a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, a lack of support, and reluctance to change on behalf of both the teacher and their colleagues. So these 5 barriers were really important to sort of influence this next stage in my research. I needed to use these to be able to understand where we need to go for this phase 2 research. What was it about the key barriers that influenced their practice, that prevented them from the implementation of TGfU? So phase 2 aimed to reduce the main barriers, those 5 ones that I mentioned as part of that phase 1. This was to reduce them for in-service PE teachers in the hope that they will be able to deliver a TGfU approach. The rationale for this is because targeting in-service teachers was very important to be able to influence what is currently happening in schools in the UK. The in-service teachers need to be committed to games-based approaches and be able to endorse these within their teaching to be able to then future generations of pupils, students, trainees, teachers, etc. to be able to uptake them within schools. So the main aim and objectives of this phase 2 project, which I want to go into a little bit more detail with you today, are to evaluate the impact of a teacher training continuing professional development or CPD on in-service PE teachers' implementation of TGfU. There were three objectives, to train in-service teachers to deliver a TGfU approach in a 6-week CPD event, to evaluate the success of PE teachers delivering a TGfU approach as part of a scheme of work through those reduction of the barriers identified in Study 1, Phase 1 of the project, and to identify what the teacher and also what my recommendations were to facilitate overcoming the barriers associated with implementing TGfU in practice. So the methodology, a pre-post design study was conducted. Questionnaires were provided outlining those 5 main barriers. 11 sort of sub-barriers came from them. For example, lack of time had lack of time planning, but also lack of time within the lesson. So these were identified and provided to the participants. Teachers indicated on a 5-point Likert scale how much they considered each one to be a barrier to implementation. Open-ended questions were also included to allow the teachers to identify any additional barriers to the ones mentioned. The teachers, so in-service teachers as a department, or as many teachers within that department, attended a 2-hour training session on TGfU between January and March 2019. Following the session, the teachers were taught using a TGfU approach for a minimum of 1 hour per week over a 6-week period during core PE lessons. Following the practice, they were given the questionnaire again to see if any of the barriers had been reduced, and a focus group with each department in the school was conducted to gain a greater depth of knowledge on the perspectives of the TGfU approach. 17 PE teachers across 5 high schools in the north of England were recruited. This composed of 8 males and 9 females aged between 22 to 45 with 9 to 22 years of teaching experience in high schools. Data analysis conducted was a paired samples t-test for the quantitative data, and the qualitative data was used thematic analysis. The paired samples t-test was conducted to compare the mean scores of the barriers to implementing TGfU for in-service teachers before and after that 6-week training event. Of the 11 TGfU sub-barriers recorded, there was a significant difference in the participant scores for 5 of the categories. Lack of time planning TGfU lessons, lack of time within lessons to teach TGfU, lack of understanding in believing needing to teach the skills first, lack of understanding in unsure how to apply TGfU in practice, and lack of knowledge, particularly in lack of training in how to apply TGfU. There was no significant difference with the remaining barriers. Despite the reduction of some of the barriers, the focus groups and open-ended questionnaire opportunities allowed the teachers to continue to discuss continued constraints on their practice. They found under the sort of lack of knowledge, a recurring lack of knowledge, in particular in the literature, has echoed in this work, that teachers have limited sports content knowledge. This knowledge could affect teachers' ability to design good games and their ability to observe and assess. Generally, the teachers could explain some of the key techniques and teaching points needed within the sport, but struggled to explain the methods for overcoming the tactical problems, particularly sort of the similarities and differences in the tactics across sports, and also how they were looking for this, how they were observing this. This was most notable in those sports that the teachers were unfamiliar with. For example, if they were very confident with football, they may have been less confident, say, for example, with netball. Also, despite improvements in the pre and post-test scores, several teachers continue to cite a lack of knowledge of how pupils with different abilities could cope with using TGfU. This resulted in some teachers resorting back to their original practice of the technique-based approach. They claimed that the pupils lacked the skills and cognitive ability to be able to perform within a game situation, particularly those with lower ability groups. The higher ability or older age groups were suggested to be more suitable to adopt a games-based approach. It is important to know that TGfU can be performed with any ability pupil, but teachers required the appropriate experience and expectations of what is an appropriately developmental game. During the lack of understanding, all participants stated the training and practice helped them in understanding the approach and being able to apply it within their teaching contexts. They often felt they had success in their lessons and concluded that their approach worked. However, they still believed that there was some issues in terms of their understanding. They particularly discussed how that they were able during the 2-hour training session to understand and believe that they could teach TGfU, but when they applied this in practice, it made it more difficult. Many of the teachers initially struggled to adopt the approach. However, it was found that they felt more confident and more prepared as they progressed through those weekly sessions. A loss of control was also a key discussion area for a majority of the teachers. They believed that the TGfU approach made a less structured sort of setting than their previous methods, and they were unsure when to step in to provide guidance to the pupils. Lack of time. Although the barriers for lack of time did improve, some of them said they still remained, particularly in terms of planning. Having the planning time within the school to be able to create those lesson plans, to be able to understand and create resources, etc., had limited effect on them based upon their institutional time available. They also noted that although the game setup took a little bit longer when they were designing a games-based approach, this became easier as the weeks went on. Reluctance to change. Although there was no significant difference within the inferential statistics, the teachers discussed this within the focus group. They noted that they were very hesitant about teaching it due to the TGfU approach due to their long-standing use of the technique-based approach, however, were willing to try. Throughout the practice, as their beliefs and confidence developed, they felt better and more able to use the TGfU approach and felt it was more likely that they would use this in the future. A major component that sort of affected their reluctance to change was increased pupil engagement. They noticed that as they were doing the TGfU lessons, more pupils were engaged and actively involved in the PE, and therefore this made them feel more confident to be able to try it again in practice. Lack of support. This was not found to be significantly different between the pre and post-test scores. However, in the questionnaires, in the open-ended responses, the teachers identified an additional barrier as when they are being observed by a non-PE specialist. This barrier could technically have been encompassed within the lack of support from colleagues. However, it suggests that participants may need a distinction of who and what this sub-barrier entails, or it may require the creation of an additional sub-barrier, lack of support from senior leadership team or a non-PE specialist. This additional barrier was briefly expanded upon in the focus groups, saying that teachers from other departments or members of senior leadership lacked familiarity, particularly within PE, PE settings, how to teach PE, and teaching approaches, which all meant that they had that difficulty in understanding and being able to give them sort of higher marks within observations or understanding within observations. The teachers identified 5 key recommendations. They needed an additional training session to be able to understand what is TGfU, gain that knowledge, gain that understanding, to then apply it in practice. They also identified that a facilitating expert, somebody who can teach them about TGfU, who can show them within their class settings what TGfU is, or even just somebody there on the field going, yes, you are teaching TGfU, or yes, this is how you could be able to enhance your practice further, was very much needed. They also noted that planning time was very much needed within their schools, but again, this is also determining on the institution and how much time they have for planning. They suggested more teaching resources, and particularly those in a centralised location at a reasonable price is what's required for teachers. And the senior leadership team endorsement of using a game-based approach within schools is very important as well. So the future directions, there is more need to increase longitudinal interventions, particularly supporting teachers in the use of games-based approaches. Mine was a 6-week program. This needed to be more to see it across multiple school terms, across multiple different groups and activities throughout the year. We also need to have an understanding of the political agendas and institutional practices which constrain teachers and be able to find ways to sort of integrate innovative approaches around these agendas and practices. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to thank Stephen Anderson, Sandra Leyland and Jonathan Ling. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me, or you can put it in the Padlet. Thank you very much.